Hello, and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. There are places in Singapore where even the bravest refuse to linger after dark. Places where the air feels heavier and the silence carries whispers that shouldn't exist. Block 146 at Toa Payoh is one of those places, a towering structure of concrete and history that stands like a monument to something unspoken. Taxi drivers will slow down as they approach the intersection, glance at the building, and then speed up without explanation. Local residents who have lived there for decades still avoid the playground after sunset, and parents pull their children closer when walking past at night. It's not superstition that drives this behavior, it's memory, the kind that gets passed down in hushed tones and nervous glances. Because in the early 1980s, something happened in that block that changed everything, something that turned a simple housing estate into a place where the past refuses to let go. The story begins on a humid June evening in 1983, when the Toa Payoh neighborhood was still considered one of the more peaceful areas of Singapore. The Housing Development Board flats were relatively new, clean, and filled with young families trying to build their lives in the growing city. Block 146 was no different from the others. 9 stories of identical units stacked neatly on top of each other, with narrow corridors and windows that overlooked the playground below. The playground itself was modest, a swing set, a slide, and a small concrete area where children would gather in the late afternoons to play catching or hopscotch. It was a place of laughter and scraped knees, nothing more. But that changed on the night of June 17th, when a young girl named Mei Ling disappeared. Mei Ling was 7 years old, small for her age, with dark hair that her mother always tied into 2 neat braids. She was quiet, the kind of child who preferred drawing in her notebook over playing with other kids. Her family lived on the 5th floor of Block 146, and every evening after dinner, her mother would let her go downstairs to the playground for half an hour before bedtime. It was a routine, predictable and safe, until it wasn't. On that particular night, Mei Ling went downstairs at 7:30, just as the sun was beginning to set. Her mother watched from the kitchen window, as she always did, making sure her daughter stayed within view. But at some point, while washing dishes, she looked away for just a few minutes. When she looked back, the playground was empty. At first, there was no panic. Mei Ling's mother assumed she had wandered to the void deck or perhaps gone to visit a neighbor's child. She called out from the window, waited, then went downstairs herself. She asked the aunties sitting on the benches, the uncles smoking near the stairwell, the teenagers loitering by the lift lobby. No one had seen her. The search began casually, then grew frantic. Within an hour, the entire block was involved. Flashlights swept through the stairwells, voices echoed through the corridors, and someone called the police. By midnight, officers were combing through the estate, knocking on doors, checking rooftops and storage rooms. But Mei Ling was gone, as if she had simply vanished into the humid night air. 3 days later, her body was found. It was discovered in a small utility room on the 9th floor, a space that was rarely used and kept locked. The door had been forced open from the inside. Mei Ling was lying on the cold concrete floor, her body arranged in a way that suggested something deliberate, something ritualistic. Her hands were placed neatly at her sides, and her eyes were closed as if she were sleeping. But the details that followed, the ones whispered among investigators and later leaked to the press, painted a far darker picture. There were markings on the walls, symbols drawn in what appeared to be ash or charcoal, shapes that no one could identify. Candles had been burned in a circle around her, their wax pooled and hardened on the floor. And, strangest of all, there was a faint smell in the room, not of decay, but of incense, the kind used in traditional Chinese funerals. The autopsy revealed that Mei Ling had been dead for at least 2 days before she was found, but the cause of death was inconclusive. There were no signs of violence, no trauma, no indication of suffocation or poisoning. It was as if her body had simply stopped functioning. The police launched a full investigation, interviewing everyone in the block, checking for suspicious activity, reviewing any possible leads. But nothing came of it. No one had seen anything unusual. No one had heard anything. The case grew cold within months, filed away as an unsolved mystery, a tragedy without explanation. But for the residents of Block 146, the story didn't end there, because shortly after Mei Ling's death, the sightings began. It started with the night shift workers, the ones who came home in the early hours of the morning. A security guard reported seeing a small figure standing near the swings at 3 a.m., motionless, facing away from him. When he approached, the figure disappeared. A week later, a taxi driver dropping off a passenger near Block 146 saw the same thing, a child standing alone in the playground, wearing what looked like a pale dress. He honked his horn, thinking the child was lost, but when he blinked, she was gone. Then the sounds started. Residents on the 5th and 9th floors began hearing soft humming late at night, a child's voice singing a tune that no one could place. It would last for a few minutes, then stop, abruptly. Some claimed it was just the wind, or perhaps a television left on in a neighboring unit. But those who heard it knew better. The melody was too clear, too deliberate, and it always seemed to come from just outside their windows. One night in October, about 4 months after Mei Ling's death, a woman named Mrs. Lim was woken by a knocking sound. She lived on the 9th floor in a unit that faced the inner courtyard. The knocking was gentle but persistent. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. She assumed it was a neighbor, or perhaps her husband coming home late. But when she opened the door, the corridor was empty. The knocking continued. She realized it was coming from her bedroom window. She walked slowly toward the sound, her heart beating faster with each step. The window was closed, the curtains drawn. She pulled them aside and looked out into the darkness. There, pressed against the glass, was a small handprint, no bigger than a child's, smudged and faint as if left by someone who had been trying to get in. Mrs. Lim screamed and stumbled backward. Her husband rushed in and turned on the lights, but when they looked again, the handprint was gone. The next morning they reported it to the town council, but no explanation was given. Mrs. Lim refused to sleep in that room again. The incidents continued, scattered but consistent. A teenager walking home late at night claimed to see a girl standing at the top of the slide, staring down at him without moving. An elderly man watering his plants on the corridor heard footsteps behind him, light and quick, like a child running, but when he turned around, there was nothing there. A young mother, pushing her stroller past the playground in the evening, felt a sudden chill and noticed her baby staring fixedly at the empty swings, eyes wide, as if watching something invisible. The unease spread through the block like a slow infection, unspoken but understood. People began avoiding the playground after dark. Parents warned their children not to linger near the void deck, and taxi drivers, those who had heard the stories from passengers or experienced something themselves, started refusing pickups and drop-offs near Block 146 after midnight. By the mid-1980s, the haunting had become local legend. Newspaper articles occasionally referenced the unsolved case, and paranormal enthusiasts began visiting the site, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ghost. Some claimed to have recorded strange sounds on tape. Others swore they felt cold spots near the ninth-floor utility room, even in the middle of Singapore's oppressive heat. The building itself seemed to absorb the fear, becoming a place that felt wrong even in daylight. The paint on the walls looked duller, the corridors felt narrower, and the air always seemed to carry a faint metallic scent like rust or old coins. Residents who moved in during the 90s, unaware of the history, would often move out within a year, citing vague discomfort or bad luck. Those who stayed learned to live with it, to ignore the occasional flicker of movement in their peripheral vision, the unexplained footsteps, the humming that drifted through the night. There were theories, of course. Some believed Mei Ling's death was the result of a ritual gone wrong, a desperate attempt by someone dabbling in dark practices to summon something or gain something. Others thought it was the work of a deranged individual who had never been caught, someone who had performed the act as part of a twisted belief system. A few whispered that Mei Ling herself had been involved in something she didn't understand, that she had wandered into a space she shouldn't have, and paid the price. But none of these theories could explain the sightings, the sounds, the persistent feeling that something was still there, watching, waiting. And none of them could explain why the manifestations always occurred at 3 a.m., why the ghost was always seen near the blank playground, or why the humming always carried the same haunting melody. In 2006, a paranormal investigation team was granted permission to spend a night in Block 146. They set up cameras, audio recorders, and electromagnetic field detectors throughout the 9th floor and around the playground. The lead investigator, a man named Daniel Teo, had worked on dozens of cases across Southeast Asia and prided himself on his skeptical approach. He didn't believe in ghosts, not really, but he believed in documenting anomalies, in finding rational explanations for the unexplainable. The team arrived at sunset and began setting up their equipment. By 10 p.m., everything was in place. They settled in to wait, monitoring feeds from their laptops, watching for any sign of activity. For the first few hours, nothing happened. The night was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the building itself were holding its breath. At 2:50 a.m., one of the audio recorders picked up something. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the equipment, but when Daniel played it back, there was no mistaking it. A child's voice, humming softly, the melody rising and falling in a rhythm that felt both familiar and alien. The team exchanged glances. Daniel checked the timestamp. It was recorded at 2:53 a.m., 7 minutes before 3. He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the playground below. The streetlights cast long shadows across the swings and slide, and for a moment he thought he saw movement, something small and pale near the base of the slide. He blinked, and it was gone. His heart was pounding now, not from fear, but from the realization that something was happening, something he couldn't explain. At exactly 3 a.m., every piece of equipment in the room shut off simultaneously. The cameras, the recorders, the laptops, all went dark. The team sat in stunned silence, the only light coming from the dim glow of the streetlights outside. Then, from somewhere down the corridor, they heard it. Footsteps, light, quick, moving toward them. Daniel stood frozen, his hand instinctively reaching for his flashlight. The footsteps grew closer, closer, until they stopped right outside the door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, 3 soft knocks, a pause, and 3 more. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He reached for the door handle, his hand trembling, and pulled it open. The corridor was empty. But in the air, faint and unmistakable, was the smell of incense. The team packed up their equipment and left before sunrise. Daniel never released the full footage, but in interviews afterward, he admitted that what he experienced that night challenged everything he thought he knew. He described a presence, not malevolent, but deeply sad, as if something were trapped and searching for something it couldn't find. He said the humming they recorded was the sound of a child trying to remember a song, trying to hold onto something from life. And he said that when the equipment failed, he felt, just for a moment, a small hand brush against his arm, cold and impossibly light. He never returned to Block 146. Today, the block still stands, weathered and worn, but still occupied. The playground has been renovated multiple times, the old swings replaced, the slide repainted, but the stories remain. Residents still hear the humming, still see the small figure standing alone in the darkness, still feel the inexplicable chill that settles over the area when the clock strikes 3. Mei Ling's case was never solved, her killer never found, and the rituals performed in that 9th-floor utility room remain a mystery. But those who live there, those who have felt the presence and heard the sounds, know one thing for certain. Whatever happened to Mei Ling in 1983, whatever was done to her in that locked room, it left something behind. And that something is still there, wandering the playground at 3 a.m., humming a song that no one remembers, knocking on windows from the 9th floor, searching for something that can never be found. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But Block 146 is not the only place in Singapore where the past refuses to rest. Just a few kilometers away, in the eastern part of the island, stands another monument to horror, a place so infamous that even mentioning its name sends a shiver through those who know its history. It's a building that has been abandoned for decades, left to decay under the tropical sun, its halls empty and silent except for the whispers of those who claim to have heard them. This is the story of the old Changi Hospital, a place where suffering left scars so deep that they may never heal. The old Changi Hospital sits on a stretch of land near Changi Village, a structure that looks more like a relic from another era than part of modern Singapore. Built in the 1930s by the British Royal Air Force, it originally served as a military hospital, a place where soldiers were treated for injuries and illnesses during the years leading up to World War II. The building itself was designed with efficiency in mind. Long, sterile corridors, rows of identical rooms, high ceilings to allow air circulation in the tropical heat. It was a place of healing, or at least it was supposed to be. But when the Japanese invaded Singapore in 1942, everything changed. The hospital was seized and repurposed, transformed from a place of care into a site of interrogation, torture, and death. What happened within those walls during the occupation remains partially unknown, the details buried in classified files and fading memories. But the stories that have emerged paint a picture of unimaginable cruelty. During the Japanese occupation, the hospital became a holding facility for prisoners of war, resistance fighters, and suspected spies. The upper floors were converted into interrogation rooms, and the basement, once used for storage, became a place where screams echoed and bodies disappeared. Former prisoners who survived the war spoke in fragmented sentences about what they witnessed, the sounds of men crying out in the night, the smell of blood and disinfectant mixing in the humid air, the sight of bodies being carried out on stretchers and never seen again. Some described a nurse, a woman who moved through the wards like a ghost, tending to the dying with cold efficiency, her face expressionless, as she administered injections that were meant to ease pain, but often hastened death. Others spoke of a room on the 3rd floor, a room where the door was always locked, where the sounds that came from inside were so terrible that even the guards refused to stand nearby. After the war ended, the hospital was returned to British control and eventually handed over to the Singaporean government. It continued to operate as a medical facility until the early 1990s, serving the local community as a general hospital. But the building had changed. Staff members reported feeling uneasy during night shifts, hearing footsteps in empty corridors, seeing doors open and close on their own. Patients sometimes refused to stay in certain rooms, claiming they felt watched or heard whispers when no one else was there. There were incidents that couldn't be explained: medical equipment turning on by itself, cold drafts in sealed rooms, the faint smell of antiseptic appearing in areas that hadn't been used in years. The administration dismissed these as coincidences or the result of an old building settling, but the unease persisted. In 1997, the hospital was officially closed and left to decay, deemed too expensive to maintain and too outdated to renovate. It has remained abandoned ever since. But abandonment did not bring silence. In fact, it seemed to amplify whatever lingered there. Within months of the closure, security guards hired to patrol the property began reporting strange occurrences. One guard, a middle-aged man named Rahman, described his first night on duty as the most unsettling experience of his life. He was tasked with walking the perimeter every 2 hours, checking doors and windows to ensure no one had broken in. The building was dark, the power had been cut, and he relied on a flashlight to navigate the corridors. On his second patrol, around midnight, he was walking down the main hallway on the ground floor when he heard something behind him. It sounded like wheels, the slow, rhythmic squeak of a wheelchair being pushed. He stopped and turned, shining his light down the corridor. There was nothing there. He continued walking, but the sound persisted, always a few meters behind him, never quite catching up. He quickened his pace, his heart pounding, and the sound quickened too. When he reached the exit, he burst through the door and didn't look back. He quit the next morning. Another guard, a younger man named Wei Jie, lasted only 3 nights. He told his supervisor that on his final shift, while conducting a routine check of the upper floors, he entered a room on the 3rd floor and saw something that made his blood run cold. The room was empty, just bare walls and a broken bed frame, but standing in the corner, facing away from him, was a figure dressed in white. It looked like a nurse, the shape unmistakable, the uniform old-fashioned and stained. He called out, thinking it was an intruder, but the figure didn't move. He stepped closer, his flashlight beam trembling in his hand, and that's when he noticed something was wrong. The figure had no head. Where the neck should have been, there was only empty space, the white uniform ending abruptly at the shoulders. Wei Ji stumbled backward, tripping over debris, and scrambled out of the room. He ran down the stairs, through the corridors, and out into the night, leaving his flashlight behind. He refused to speak about it afterward, only saying that he would never set foot in that building again. The stories spread quickly, fueled by urban explorers and paranormal enthusiasts who began sneaking into the hospital despite the no trespassing signs. They documented their experiences online, posting photos of graffiti-covered walls, decaying medical equipment, and long, empty hallways that seemed to stretch into darkness. Some claimed to have captured orbs of light in their photographs. Others recorded audio that contained unexplained voices and whispers. One group of teenagers, who broke in late at night, described hearing the sound of children laughing, echoing through the building, even though there were no children anywhere nearby. Another explorer reported seeing a shadow move across the wall, shaped like a person but impossibly tall, stretching from floor to ceiling as it glided down the corridor. These accounts were often dismissed as exaggerations or the result of overactive imaginations, but they were consistent enough to create a reputation. The old Changi Hospital became known as one of the most haunted places in Singapore, a location where the boundary between the living and the dead felt dangerously thin. One of the most persistent stories involves a wheelchair, an old rusted model that was left behind when the hospital closed. Multiple visitors have reported seeing it, sitting alone in the middle of a hallway or positioned near the entrance to the basement. Some claim it moves on its own, rolling slowly across the floor with no one pushing it. Others say they've heard it squeaking through the building at night, the sound echoing through the empty wards. In 2008, a man named Jason Koh, a freelance photographer, entered the hospital with the intention of documenting its decay for an art project. He brought a camera, a flashlight, and a voice recorder, determined to capture the building's eerie atmosphere. He spent hours exploring the different floors, taking photos of peeling paint, broken windows, and abandoned gurneys. But when he descended to the basement, he felt something shift. The air grew colder, heavier, and the smell of antiseptic, sharp and chemical, filled his nostrils. He paused, confused, because the building had been sealed for over a decade and there was no reason for that smell to be there. He continued deeper into the basement, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The rooms down there were smaller, more claustrophobic, with low ceilings and narrow doorways. In one of the rooms, he found the wheelchair. It was sitting in the center of the space, facing the doorway, as if waiting for someone. Jason raised his camera and took a photo, the flash illuminating the room for a brief moment. As the light faded, he heard something, a faint creaking, sound like metal under pressure. He looked down at the wheelchair and realized, with a sickening jolt, that it was moving, not rolling, but rocking slightly, back and forth, as if someone were sitting in it and shifting their weight. His breath caught in his throat. He took a step back, his flashlight beam shaking, and that's when he heard it. A voice, soft and rasping, coming from somewhere behind the wheelchair. It said one word: leave. Jason didn't wait. He turned and ran, stumbling through the basement, up the stairs, and out of the building. He never returned, and he never finished his project. The photos he took that night, including the one of the wheelchair, showed nothing unusual. But when he played back the audio from his recorder, there was something there. Underneath the sound of his footsteps and breathing, faint and almost imperceptible, was the sound of wheels squeaking, and a voice repeating the same word over and over: leave, leave, leave. The legend of the headless nurse is perhaps the most chilling. According to multiple accounts, she appears on the third floor, always in the same corridor, always dressed in the same stained white uniform. Some say she pushes the wheelchair. Others claim she simply walks, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she's searching for something. Those who have seen her describe a feeling of overwhelming dread, a primal instinct that tells them to run. One urban explorer, a woman named Lynn, encountered the nurse in 2012. She had entered the hospital with a group of friends, all of them skeptics, hoping to debunk the rumors. They split up to cover more ground, and Lynn found herself alone on the third floor. She was filming with her phone, narrating her experience, when she turned a corner and saw the figure. It was standing at the end of the hallway, motionless, the white uniform glowing faintly in the darkness. Lynn froze, her phone still recording. She called out, asking if anyone was there, but the figure didn't respond. Then slowly, it began to move toward her. Lynn's heart hammered in her chest. She took a step back, then another, and that's when she realized the figure had no head. She screamed and ran, the phone slipping from her hand. Her friends found her minutes later, sobbing and incoherent. The phone was recovered, but the footage was corrupted, showing only static and brief flashes of the hallway. Lynn never spoke publicly about what she saw, but those close to her say she's never been the same. Over the years, the government has attempted to secure the site more thoroughly, installing fences, hiring additional security, and threatening legal action against trespassers. But the stories persist, and people continue to visit, drawn by curiosity or a desire to experience the unexplainable. Some leave offerings near the entrance, joss sticks, paper money, small trinkets, as a sign of respect for whatever lingers inside. Others simply stand at the edge of the property, looking up at the dark windows, wondering what horrors unfolded within those walls and whether they will ever truly be at rest. The old Changi Hospital remains a scar on the landscape, a reminder that some places are marked by suffering so profound that it seeps into the very foundation, refusing to fade even as the building crumbles around it. There are no plans to demolish the hospital, and no plans to renovate it. It stands frozen in time, a monument to pain and fear, and those who have ventured inside, those who have felt the cold touch of something unseen or heard the whispers in the darkness, know that it will never be just an abandoned building. It is something more, something that defies explanation, a place where the past is not memory but presence, where the dead do not rest, and where a headless nurse still walks the halls, pushing a rusty wheelchair, forever searching for something that can never be found. And in the air, always, is the faint smell of antiseptic lingering, like a ghost itself, a reminder that some wounds, no matter how much time passes, never truly heal. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. These tales from Singapore are only the beginning, and while they offer a glimpse into the dark corners of the island's history, they are far from the only accounts of the supernatural in Asia. In the next part, we will journey deeper into the unknown, exploring stories where the boundaries between reality and nightmare blur even further, where the things that begin as coincidences twist into something far more terrifying, and where the living learn, far too late, that some doors should never be opened. In the crowded streets of Ho Chi Minh City, where motorbikes weave through traffic and vendors call out from every corner, there are buildings that carry histories too heavy to forget. One of them stands on Nguyen Thi Minh Khai Street, a narrow apartment block with faded yellow walls and rusted balconies. The kind of structure that blends into the urban landscape so completely that most people pass it without a second glance. But those who live there, those who have spent years within its walls, know that the building is not like the others. They know about the sounds that drift through the stairwell late at night, the soft voice singing a melody that should have been silenced decades ago. They know about the figure that sometimes appears on the fourth-floor balcony, a shadow that watches the street below as if waiting for someone who will never arrive. And they know that whatever happened in this building during the war, whatever tragedy unfolded within its concrete frame, has left something behind that refuses to leave. The building was constructed in the early 1960s, during a time when Saigon was still the capital of South Vietnam, and the war was escalating with every passing month. The city was growing rapidly, absorbing refugees from the countryside and soldiers from all over the world, and housing was in short supply. The apartment block on Nguyen Thi Minh Khai Street was built quickly and cheaply, designed to accommodate as many families as possible in a small footprint. It was 4 stories tall, with narrow staircases and thin walls, each unit barely large enough for a family of 4. The residents were mostly working-class people, shopkeepers, seamstresses, cyclo-drivers, and their families, all trying to survive in a city that felt increasingly unstable. Among them was a woman named Lan, her young son Min, and her husband Duke, a soldier who was rarely home. Lan was in her late 20s, soft-spoken and devoted to her son, who was only 5 years old. Duke had been drafted into the Army of the Republic of Vietnam and was stationed somewhere near the Cambodian border, a place he rarely spoke about in his infrequent letters. Lan spent her days sewing clothes for a local shop and her evenings caring for Min, singing him to sleep with lullabies her own mother had taught her. The apartment they lived in was on the 4th floor, a cramped space with a single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a balcony that overlooked the street. Despite the constant noise of the city and the fear that hung over everything, Lan tried to create a sense of normalcy for her son. She would sit with him on the balcony in the evenings, pointing out the stars that managed to shine through the light pollution, telling him stories about his father and promising that one day the war would end and they would all be together again. But in 1968, during the Tet Offensive, that fragile sense of normalcy shattered. The offensive began on the night of January 30th, when Viet Cong forces launched coordinated attacks across South Vietnam, including Saigon. The city erupted into chaos, gunfire echoed through the streets, and buildings became targets as both sides fought for control. The apartment block on Nguyen Thi Minh Khai Street was not a military installation. It was not strategically important, but it was in the wrong place at the wrong time. On the third night of the offensive, a stray shell, whether fired by accident or as part of a larger bombardment, struck the building. The explosion tore through the 4th floor, collapsing part of the structure and sending debris cascading down onto the street below. Several families were killed instantly, their bodies buried under concrete and twisted metal. Among the dead were Lan and her son Min. The details of their deaths were never fully documented. The city was in chaos, and individual tragedies were lost in the larger devastation. But neighbors who survived the blast later spoke about what they remembered. They said that Lan had been on the balcony with Min when the shell hit, that she had been singing to him, trying to calm him as the sounds of gunfire grew closer. The explosion had been sudden and absolute, giving them no time to react. Their bodies were recovered days later, after the fighting subsided, and buried in a mass grave on the outskirts of the city. Duke, Lan's husband, never learned of their deaths until weeks later, when he returned to Saigon on leave. By then, the apartment block had been partially repaired. New families had moved in, and the war had continued as if nothing had happened. Duke disappeared after that. Some said he deserted, others claimed he was killed in action, but no one knew for certain. What was certain was that the 4th floor apartment where Lan and Min had lived remained vacant for years, and when new tenants finally moved in, they never stayed long. The first reports of something unusual came in the early 1970s, after the war had ended and the country was beginning to rebuild. A family who had moved into the 4th floor apartment, unaware of its history, began complaining about strange sounds at night. The mother, a woman named Hoa, told her neighbors that she could hear singing, a woman's voice, soft and melodic, echoing through the walls. At first, she thought it was coming from another apartment, perhaps a radio or a neighbor singing to their own child. But the sound was too clear, too close, and it always came from the same place, the balcony. Hoa would get up in the middle of the night and check, but the balcony was always empty, the door locked from the inside. The singing would continue for a few minutes, then stop abruptly, leaving only silence. Her husband dismissed it as her imagination, stress from the move, but Hoa knew what she heard. After 3 months, they moved out, citing personal reasons. Other families followed, and each one reported similar experiences. The singing was the most common complaint, but there were other things as well. Children living in the apartment would sometimes talk about a woman They saw on the balcony a woman in old-fashioned clothing who smiled at them but never spoke. Parents would find toys moved to different locations as if someone had been playing with them while the family was out. There were cold spots in the apartment, areas where the temperature would drop suddenly and inexplicably, even in the sweltering heat of a Saigon summer. And, on certain nights, usually around the anniversary of the Tet Offensive, residents on lower floors claimed they could hear footsteps on the stairs, light and hurried, followed by the sound of a door closing on the fourth floor, even though no one had entered or left. By the 1980s, the apartment had gained a reputation, and landlords struggled to keep it occupied. Some tenants stayed out of necessity, unable to afford housing elsewhere, but they learned to live with the phenomena, to ignore the singing, to avoid the balcony at night, to tell their children that the woman they saw was just a dream. One tenant, an elderly man named Fan, lived there for nearly 5 years. He was a veteran himself, a man who had seen too much death to be frightened by ghosts. He told his neighbors that he heard the singing every night, that he had grown used to it, that it even brought him a strange sense of comfort. He said the woman's voice was beautiful, filled with sadness but also love, and that he believed she was still singing to her son, still trying to protect him even in death. Fan claimed he had seen her once, standing on the balcony in the early morning light, her back turned to him, her hair long and dark. He had spoken to her, asking if she needed help, but she had not responded. She simply stood there, gazing down at the street, as if waiting for someone. Then, as the sun rose higher, she faded, dissolving into the air like mist. The legend spread beyond the building, becoming a story told in the neighborhood, passed down from one generation to the next. People began to avoid walking past the apartment block late at night, claiming they could hear the lullaby drifting down from the fourth floor, haunting and ethereal. Some said they had seen the figure on the balcony themselves, a silhouette that appeared and disappeared without explanation. Others spoke of a presence, not malevolent, but deeply sorrowful, that lingered in the air around the building, a grief so profound that it had seeped into the structure itself. The apartment became a symbol of the war's countless personal tragedies, a reminder that behind every statistic, every casualty number, was a story like Lan and Min's, a life cut short, a love that endured beyond death. In 2003, a young journalist named Tuan decided to investigate the story for a local newspaper. He had grown up hearing about the haunted apartment and was skeptical, believing the legend was nothing more than superstition amplified by trauma. He arranged to spend a night in the fourth floor unit, which was temporarily vacant with the permission of the landlord. He brought a notebook, a camera, and a recording device, determined to document his experience objectively. He arrived at sunset and made himself comfortable, sitting on the floor near the balcony door. The apartment was sparse, just bare walls and old furniture, but it felt oddly heavy, as if the air itself carried weight. Tuan waited, watching the light fade outside, listening to the sounds of the city below. For the first few hours, nothing happened. He jotted down notes, describing the atmosphere, the peeling paint, the faint smell of mildew. But as midnight approached, something changed. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, a chill that made Tuan's breath visible. He stood up, confused, and checked the windows, but they were all closed. Then he heard it, the singing. It started softly, so faint he thought he might be imagining it, but it grew steadily clearer. A woman's voice, singing a lullaby in Vietnamese, the melody slow and mournful. Tuan's heart began to race. He grabbed his recording device and pressed record, holding it up toward the sound. The singing seemed to be coming from the balcony, just beyond the closed door. He approached slowly, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. He opened the door and stepped out into the night air. The balcony was empty, but the singing continued, surrounding him, as if the voice were coming from everywhere at once. He looked down at the street below, then up at the sky, searching for a source, but there was nothing. Just the voice, beautiful and heartbreaking, singing a song that no one should be able to hear. Tuan stood there, frozen, his mind struggling to process what was happening. Then, at the far edge of the balcony, near the railing, he saw something. A shape, faint and translucent, like a figure made of smoke. It was a woman, her back turned to him, her hair long and flowing. She was holding something in her arms, something small, a child. Tuan's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to speak, to ask who she was, but the words wouldn't come. The figure remained still for a long moment, and then, slowly, she turned her head toward him. Tuan saw her face, pale and serene, her eyes filled with an infinite sadness. She looked at him, not with anger or fear, but with a quiet resignation, as if she knew he was there but did not care. Then she turned back toward the street, the child still cradled in her arms, and continued to sing. Tuan stood there, unable to move, until the song ended. The moment it did, the figure dissolved, vanishing into the darkness, and the temperature returned to normal. Tuan stumbled back into the apartment, his hands shaking, and gathered his belongings. He left before dawn, and never returned. The article he wrote was published a few weeks later, but it was heavily edited, stripped of the more supernatural elements, and framed as a human interest story about wartime trauma and urban legends. Tuan included a brief mention of the sounds he heard, attributing them to acoustic anomalies and the power of suggestion. But he left out the part about the figure on the balcony. In private, however, he told friends that what he experienced that night was real, that he had seen something he couldn't explain, something that defied logic and reason. He described the woman's face, the sorrow in her eyes, the way she held the child, as if protecting him from a world that had already taken everything. He said that the lullaby she sang was not just a song. It was a promise, a refusal to let go, even in death. Today, the apartment block still stands, though it shows its age. The yellow walls are more faded now, the balconies more rusted, and the building itself leans slightly, as if weary from decades of holding up the weight of its history. The fourth-floor apartment is occasionally occupied, usually by tenants who either don't know the stories or choose not to believe them. But the reports continue. Residents on other floors still hear the singing late at night, still see the shadow on the balcony, still feel the cold spots, and the sense of a presence that watches and waits. Some leave offerings outside the apartment door, incense and flowers, a gesture of respect for a mother and child who never got to say goodbye. Others simply avoid the fourth floor altogether, taking the long way around, unwilling to risk an encounter with something they don't understand. And on certain nights, when the city is quieter and the stars manage to break through the haze, the lullaby can still be heard, drifting through the stairwell, a voice that refuses to be silenced, a love that endures beyond death, and a reminder that some wounds, carved by war and loss, never truly heal. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The echoes of war have a way of lingering long after the battles have ended, leaving behind not just ruins and memories, but something deeper, something that clings to the places where suffering was most acute. From the streets of Vietnam, we now travel to Indonesia, to a city called Semarang in central Java, where a building stands as a testament to colonial ambition and wartime brutality. It's a place where 1,000 doors lead to 1,000 nightmares, and where the past has never truly been laid to rest. Lawang Sowu is a name that translates to 1,000 doors, though the actual number is closer to 600. But when you stand before the building, the name feels appropriate, because every hallway seems to branch into another. Every corridor opens onto something unexpected, and every doorway feels like an invitation into darkness. The structure was built in 1904 by the Dutch East Indies Railway Company, designed as a grand administrative headquarters that would showcase colonial power and efficiency. It was an architectural marvel for its time, a sprawling complex of interconnected buildings with high arched windows, wide verandas, and intricate tilework. It was meant to be a symbol of progress, a beacon of modernity in a land the Dutch believed they were civilizing. But like so many monuments to empire, it became something else entirely, a place where the violence of colonialism and war would leave scars that time could not erase. For nearly 4 decades, Lawang Sowu functioned as intended, housing offices, meeting rooms, and administrative staff who managed the railway network across Java. The building was filled with the sounds of typewriters, the rustle of paperwork, and the footsteps of clerks moving through its many corridors. But in 1942, when the Japanese invaded and occupied Indonesia, everything changed. The Dutch were expelled, their staff imprisoned or killed, and the building was seized by the Japanese military. Lawang Sowu was repurposed, transformed from a center of commerce into a prison and interrogation facility. The large rooms that had once held desks and filing cabinets were converted into cells, and the basement, a dark labyrinth of underground tunnels, became a place where prisoners were tortured and executed. What happened there during the occupation remains partially hidden, buried in classified reports and the fading memories of survivors. But the stories that have emerged are enough to chill anyone who hears them. Prisoners held at Lawang Sowu described the basement as a place of unimaginable horror. The tunnels were narrow and damp, lit only by flickering lanterns, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and blood. Interrogations were carried out with brutal efficiency, and those who did not cooperate, or who were simply unlucky, disappeared into the darkness and were never seen again. Some prisoners were hanged, others were shot, and many simply died from the conditions, starvation, disease, and despair taking their toll. The bodies were buried in mass graves or disposed of in ways that left no trace, erased from history as if they had never existed. By the time the war ended in 1945, Lawang Sowu had become synonymous with death, a place that locals avoided and spoke about only in whispers. After the Japanese surrender, the building fell into disrepair. It was briefly used by Indonesian forces during the struggle for independence, serving as a makeshift barracks and later as a site for military operations. But by the 1960s, it had been abandoned, left to decay under the tropical sun and rain. The once grand halls became overgrown with vines, the windows shattered, and the floors cracked and buckled. Squatters moved in, then moved out, claiming the building was cursed. Graffiti covered the walls, and the structure became a popular spot for teenagers looking for a thrill, a dare to explore the haunted ruins. But those who ventured inside often left with stories that were hard to dismiss as mere imagination. The first widely reported paranormal incident occurred in the 1970s, when a group of university students entered Lawang Sowu at night on a dare. They brought flashlights and cameras, determined to prove that the ghost stories were nothing but superstition. They explored the upper floors first, documenting the decay, the broken furniture, the remnants of a building that had once been magnificent. But when they descended into the basement, the atmosphere changed. The air grew colder, heavier, and the darkness seemed to press in around them. One of the students, a young woman named Sari, described feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, as if they were being watched by something malevolent. She wanted to leave, but the others insisted on continuing. They moved deeper into the tunnels, their flashlights barely cutting through the gloom, and that's when they heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from somewhere ahead of them. They stopped, called out, but received no response. The footsteps continued, growing closer, and then suddenly stopped. In the silence that followed, they heard something else. A woman's voice, soft and pleading, speaking in a language none of them could understand. The group panicked and ran, stumbling through the tunnels, desperate to find the exit. Sari tripped and fell, her flashlight skittering across the floor. As she reached for it, she saw something in the beam of light, a figure standing at the far end of the tunnel, barely visible in the shadows. It was a woman, her hair long and dark, her clothing tattered and stained. She was facing away, but even from a distance, Sari could sense that something was wrong. The figure's proportions seemed off, too tall, too thin, and the way she stood was unnatural, as if she were not fully solid. Sari scrambled to her feet and ran, not looking back, her heart pounding in her chest. The group made it out of the building and swore never to return. Sari refused to talk about what she saw, but her friends noticed that she became withdrawn afterward, as if something in that basement had followed her home. Over the years, similar stories accumulated. Visitors to Lawang Sowu reported seeing shadowy figures behind doors, glimpsed for just a moment before vanishing. Some claimed to feel cold, gusts of wind in rooms that were sealed, windows and doors closed, no source for the sudden chill. Others described hearing voices, whispers in languages they couldn't identify, conversations that seemed to be happening just out of earshot. The basement remained the most feared area, a place where even the bravest hesitated to venture. Security guards hired to patrol the building at night refused to go down there, and those who did often quit shortly afterward, citing experiences they couldn't explain and didn't want to repeat. One of the most persistent legends involves a well located near the basement entrance. The well is old, dating back to the original construction of the building, and it descends deep into the earth, its bottom hidden in darkness. During the Japanese occupation, it's believed that the well was used to dispose of bodies, prisoners who had been killed and needed to be hidden. Whether this is true or merely a rumor amplified by fear is unclear, but the well has become a focal point for paranormal activity. Visitors who stand near it report feeling dizzy, nauseous, as if the ground beneath them were unstable. Some claim to hear sounds rising from the depths, faint cries, the splash of something heavy hitting water. And photographs taken near the well, even in modern times with digital cameras, often contain anomalies, streaks of light, blurred shapes, and in some cases the image of a woman with long black hair, her face obscured, appearing in the background where no one was standing. In 2009, a paranormal investigation team from Jakarta was granted permission to explore Lawang Sowu for a television documentary. The team consisted of 4 members, a lead investigator named Budi, a cameraman, a sound technician, and a psychic medium named Dewey. They arrived in the late afternoon and began setting up their equipment, cameras, audio recorders, and electromagnetic field detectors. Dewey, the medium, immediately expressed discomfort. She said the building felt oppressive, that the energy inside was dark and angry, and that she could sense the presence of multiple spirits, many of them confused and in pain. Budi, a skeptic by nature, noted her observations but insisted on proceeding. They waited until nightfall, then began their investigation. The team started on the upper floors, moving through the old offices and meeting rooms. The footage they captured showed a building in advanced decay, paint peeling from the walls, furniture rotting, and nature slowly reclaiming the space. But the atmosphere was undeniably eerie, the silence broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the distant hum of the city outside. Dewey remained uneasy, pausing frequently, her eyes scanning the empty rooms as if she could see something the others could not. She described feeling watched, followed, and at one point she stopped in front of a closed door and refused to open it. She said there was something on the other side, something that did not want them there. Booty, ever the skeptic, opened the door himself. The room beyond was empty, just another abandoned office, but the air inside was noticeably colder, and the electromagnetic field detector in his hand spiked suddenly, then returned to normal. They moved on, but Dewey's distress continued to grow. When they descended to the basement, the tension became palpable. The tunnels were narrow and claustrophobic, the walls damp with moisture, and the darkness seemed absolute despite their lights. Dewey stopped after only a few meters, her breathing rapid and shallow. She said she could hear voices, dozens of them, all speaking at once, and that the spirits here were not at peace. She begged Booty to leave, but he insisted on continuing. They moved deeper into the tunnels, the cameraman filming everything, the sound technician monitoring the audio. And then, without warning, all of their equipment failed simultaneously. The cameras went dark, the audio recorders stopped, and even their flashlights flickered and died. They were plunged into total darkness. Booty fumbled for a backup flashlight, his hands shaking, and when he finally managed to turn it on, he swept the beam around the tunnel. That's when he saw her. Standing at the end of the corridor, just beyond the reach of the light, was a woman. Her hair was long and black, cascading down her back, and her clothing was old, torn and stained with something dark. She was facing away from them, but even from a distance, Booty could tell that something was wrong. The figure was too still, too rigid, and the air around her seemed to shimmer, as if she were not entirely solid. Dewey screamed, a raw sound of pure terror, and the figure turned. Booty's flashlight caught her face for just a moment, pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and black, her mouth open in a silent scream. Then the light went out again, and they were thrown back into darkness. The team ran, stumbling through the tunnels, their hands groping along the walls, desperate to find the exit. They could hear footsteps behind them, fast and relentless, and Dewey swore she felt something brush against her arm, cold and skeletal. They burst out of the basement and into the night air, gasping and shaking. They did not stop until they were outside the gates of Lawang Sowu, and even then they looked back at the building with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The footage they had captured was reviewed later, but most of it was corrupted, showing only static and brief flashes of the tunnels. However, one segment remained intact, a 5-second clip from the moment before the equipment failed. In it, barely visible in the background, was the figure of a woman, her hair obscuring her face, standing motionless in the shadows. The documentary was never completed, and the team refused to return to Lawang Sowu. Since then, the building has been partially restored and opened to the public as a historical site and museum. Tours are conducted during the day, and the local government has worked to preserve the structure as a piece of cultural heritage. But even with the renovations, even with the presence of tourists and guides, the stories persist. Visitors still report strange experiences, doors that open on their own, cold spots in rooms that should be warm, and the faint sound of footsteps echoing through empty corridors. Photographs taken inside the building, especially near the well and in the basement, often contain unexplained anomalies. And on certain nights, when the museum is closed and the building stands empty, security guards claim to see lights flickering in windows that have no power and shadows moving through rooms where no one should be. Lawang Sowu has become more than just a building. It is a monument to suffering, a place where the violence of history has left an indelible mark. The ghosts that are said to haunt it, the woman with long black hair, the shadowy figures behind the doors, the voices in the tunnels, are not just stories. They are echoes of real people who died in fear and pain, whose lives were erased by war and cruelty, and whose presence remains because they have nowhere else to go. For those who have ventured into its depths, who have felt the cold touch of something unseen or heard the whispers in the darkness, Lawang Sowu is a reminder that some places are more than stone and mortar. They are vessels of memory, holding the pain and sorrow of the past, and no amount of restoration or tourism can cleanse them of what they have witnessed. The 1,000 doors of Lawang Sowu stand open, inviting visitors to explore its history. But for those who look too closely, who venture too deep, the doors may lead to something far more terrifying than the past. They may lead to a place where the dead still walk, still suffer, and still wait for a release that may never come. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The stories we've shared so far have taken us through the haunted corners of Asia, places where tragedy and violence have left their mark in ways that defy explanation. But the final 2 stories are different. They're quieter, more intimate, the kind of horror that doesn't announce itself with screams or shadows, but instead creeps into your thoughts and stays there long after the telling ends. These are stories where the terror lies not in what is seen, but in what is felt, in the slow realization that the world is far stranger and more fragile than we ever imagined. There are places in the world where history and legend intertwine so completely that separating truth from myth becomes impossible. The ruins of Bangar Fort in Rajasthan, India, are one such place, a sprawling complex of crumbling palaces, temples, and walls that sits abandoned in the Aravalli Range, surrounded by nothing but dust, scrubland, and an oppressive silence that feels unnatural. The fort is old, dating back to the late 16th century, and it was once a thriving settlement, home to thousands of people who lived and worked within its protective walls. But today it stands empty, a ghost town in the truest sense, and the Indian government has placed signs at every entrance warning visitors that entry is strictly prohibited between sunset and sunrise. The official reason given is safety concerns, the risk of wild animals or unstable structures. But those who live in the nearby villages know the real reason. They know that Bangar is cursed, that something dark happened there centuries ago, and that the curse has never been lifted. They know that those who have ignored the warnings, who have stayed in the fort after dark, have never been seen again. The story of Bangar begins in 1573, when a ruler named Bhagwant Das, a nobleman in the court of the Mughal Emperor Akbar, commissioned the construction of a fortified city for his younger son, Madho Singh. The location was carefully chosen, nestled between hills that provided natural protection, and situated near trade routes that would ensure prosperity. Bhagwant Das consulted with a holy man, a sage named Guru Balunath, who lived in meditation on one of the nearby hills. The sage gave his blessing for the construction, but imposed a condition. He said that the buildings could be erected, but they must never cast a shadow on his dwelling place. If they did, he warned, the city would be doomed, cursed to fall into ruin and decay. Bhagwant Das agreed, and construction began. For decades, Bangar thrived, growing into a prosperous town with markets, temples, and grand palaces. Madho Singh ruled wisely, and the people lived in relative peace. But prosperity breeds ambition, and ambition often leads to tragedy. The curse is said to have been triggered during the reign of Madho Singh's granddaughter, Princess Ratnavati, a woman renowned throughout the region for her extraordinary beauty and intelligence. She was the jewel of Bangar, admired by nobles and commoners alike, and suitors came from distant kingdoms hoping to win her hand. But among those who desired her was a man who had no right to, a tantric, a practitioner of dark magic, named Singhia. He was not a nobleman or a warrior, but a sorcerer who lived on the outskirts of the town, feared and avoided by most. Singhia had watched Ratnavati from afar for years, his obsession growing with each passing day until it consumed him entirely. He knew she would never accept him, that a princess of her stature would never marry a man of his background, but he believed he could use his powers to bend her will, to make her love him through magic. One day, Singhia saw an opportunity. Ratnavati's handmaiden had been sent to the market to purchase perfume, a fragrant oil that the princess favored. Singhia followed the handmaiden and approached her, offering to sell her a superior product at a lower price. The handmaiden, unaware of his intentions, agreed. But the oil Singhia gave her was not ordinary perfume. It was enchanted, infused with a spell designed to make anyone who wore it fall deeply and irrevocably in love with him. He watched as the handmaiden returned to the palace, confident that his plan would succeed. But Ratnavati was not a fool. When the handmaiden presented the perfume, the princess examined it closely, and something about it felt wrong. The scent was too strong, too cloying, and the liquid seemed to shimmer in a way that natural oils did not. She suspected trickery and decided to test it. She poured the oil onto a large stone near the palace courtyard, and as the liquid touched the rock, something extraordinary happened. The stone began to move, rolling on its own, picking up speed as it tumbled down the hill toward the place where Singhia stood watching from a distance. The stone struck Singhia with tremendous force, crushing him beneath its weight. As he lay dying, broken and in agony, he used the last of his strength to utter a curse. He declared that Bangar would be destroyed, that no one within its walls would survive, and that the town would remain uninhabited forever, a place of death and despair. He cursed Ratnavati specifically, saying that she and all her descendants would die unnatural deaths, that their souls would never find peace. And then he died, his final breath carrying the weight of his hatred and obsession. Within a year, his words came true. Bangar was attacked by a neighboring kingdom, and in the battle that followed, the town was overrun. Ratnavati and most of the inhabitants were killed, and the survivors fled, never to return. The buildings, which had grown taller over the years, eventually cast their shadow on Guru Balu Nath's dwelling, violating the condition he had set. The sage's warning and the tantric's curse converged, and Bangar became a place abandoned by the living, claimed by something far darker. For centuries, the ruins sat untouched, slowly crumbling under the relentless sun and monsoon rains. Villagers in the surrounding areas avoided the site, passing down stories from generation to generation about the terrible things that happened to those who ventured too close. There were tales of travelers who had taken shelter in the ruins overnight and were found the next morning, dead, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Others spoke of strange lights, seen flickering in the windows of the abandoned palaces, and voices heard singing or wailing in languages no one could identify. Animals refused to enter the fort after dark, and birds would not nest in the trees that grew within its walls. The place had a reputation, and that reputation kept most people away. But in the late 20th century, As India modernized and tourism grew, Bangor began to attract a different kind of visitor. Thrill seekers, paranormal enthusiasts, and curious travelers heard the stories and wanted to see the cursed fort for themselves. The Archaeological Survey of India, recognizing the historical value of the site, began efforts to preserve what remained of the structures and opened it to the public during daylight hours. But they also erected signs, stern warnings that entry after sunset was strictly forbidden. The official stance was that the restriction was for safety, to prevent accidents in the dark or encounters with wild animals. But the locals knew better, and whispers persisted that the real reason was far more sinister. There were reports, never officially confirmed, of people who had ignored the warnings and stayed past sunset, only to vanish without a trace. No bodies were ever found, no evidence of foul play, just empty spaces where people should have been. One of the most chilling accounts came in 1997, when a group of college students from Delhi decided to spend a night in Bangor as part of a dare. There were 5 of them, 3 young men and 2 young women, all in their early 20s and eager to prove their bravery. They arrived in the late afternoon, explored the ruins during daylight, taking photographs and marveling at the architecture. As the sun began to set, they ignored the warnings posted at the entrance and made their way deeper into the fort, setting up camp in one of the old palace courtyards. They built a small fire, laughed and joked, and settled in for what they assumed would be an uneventful night. But as darkness fell, the atmosphere changed. The air grew colder, far colder than it should have been in the Rajasthan desert, and the silence became oppressive, pressing in on them from all sides. Around midnight, one of the young women, a girl named Priya, began to feel uneasy. She told her friends that she heard something, a faint sound like footsteps, coming from one of the nearby buildings. The others laughed it off, attributing it to nerves or the wind, but Priya insisted. She said the footsteps were deliberate, rhythmic, as if someone were pacing back and forth just out of sight. They all fell silent, listening, and after a moment they heard it too, slow, heavy footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. One of the young men, emboldened by bravado or perhaps trying to mask his own fear, grabbed a flashlight and announced he would investigate. He walked toward the source of the sound, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness, while the others watched from the courtyard. He disappeared into the building, and for a few minutes they could see the light moving inside, flickering across the walls. Then the light went out, and they heard him scream, a sound of pure terror that echoed through the ruins, and then abruptly stopped. The group panicked. They called out his name, shouting into the darkness, but there was no response. The other 2 young men ran toward the building, desperate to find their friend, while Priya and the other girl stayed by the fire, too frightened to move. Minutes passed, then an hour, and the 2 young men did not return. Priya and her friend huddled together, their eyes scanning the shadows, their hearts pounding. They heard more sounds now, not just footsteps, but voices, whispers in a language they didn't understand, and the occasional sound of something heavy being dragged across stone. As the night wore on, the fire began to die, and they realized with growing horror that they had not brought enough wood to keep it burning until dawn. The flames flickered lower and lower, and the darkness crept closer, and that's when they saw it. A figure, tall and indistinct, standing at the edge of the courtyard, watching them. It did not move, did not speak, but its presence was undeniable, malevolent, and patient. Priya and her friend ran. They abandoned the camp, the fire, and any hope of finding their companions, and fled toward the main gate, stumbling over rubble and debris in their haste. They did not stop until they were outside the fort, collapsing on the ground, gasping for air. When the sun rose a few hours later, they returned with villagers and local authorities to search for the three young men. The search lasted 2 days, combing through every building, every corridor, every hidden corner of the fort, but no trace of the missing students was ever found. No bodies, no clothing, no signs of struggle. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead due to accidental causes, but Priya and her friend knew the truth. They had been taken by something that lived in Bangar, something that did not let go. The incident was widely reported in the Indian press, and it reignited public interest in the curse. Paranormal investigators from across the country descended on Bangar, armed with cameras, recording devices, and an eagerness to document the supernatural. Some claim to have captured evidence, photographs showing strange orbs of light, audio recordings of disembodied voices, and video footage of shadows moving independently of any light source. Others reported physical sensations, sudden drops in temperature, feelings of being watched or followed, and in some cases actual physical contact, invisible hands pushing or grabbing them. One investigator, a man named Arjun Mehta, described an experience that left him deeply shaken. He had been exploring the ruins alone, filming with a handheld camera, when he entered a section of the fort known as the Dancers' Havli, a building where entertainers once performed for the royal court. As Arjun walked through the Havli, he heard music, faint but unmistakable, the sound of traditional Rajasthani instruments, the tabla and sitar, playing a slow, mournful melody. He followed the sound, his camera recording, and found himself in a large open room with high ceilings and intricate carvings on the walls. The music seemed to be coming from the center of the room, but there was nothing there, no instruments, no people, just empty space. He stood there, confused and increasingly unnerved, and then the music stopped. In the silence that followed, he heard a woman's voice, soft and melodic, singing in Hindi. The voice sang of loss, of betrayal, of a love that ended in tragedy. Arjun's hands trembled as he raised the camera, trying to capture the source of the voice, but the room remained empty. Then, at the far end of the room, he saw movement. A figure, translucent and shimmering, appeared in the doorway. It was a woman dressed in traditional attire, her face partially obscured by a veil. She stood there for a moment, and Arjun felt an overwhelming sadness wash over him, a grief so profound that tears began streaming down his face. The figure raised one hand, as if reaching toward him, and then she vanished. Arjun left Bangar that day and never returned. He published the footage online, and it quickly went viral, viewed by millions. Skeptics dismissed it as a hoax, claiming the video had been edited or staged. But those who watched it closely noticed something unsettling. In the final seconds of the footage, just before the figure disappears, there is a brief moment where the camera captures a reflection in one of the cracked mirrors on the wall. In the reflection, dozens of faces can be seen, pale and distorted, all staring directly at the camera. Experts analyzed the footage, and while some claimed it was a trick of light or digital artifacts, others could not explain what they were seeing. Arjun himself refused to discuss the experience in detail, saying only that what he encountered in Bangar was real, and that the fort was not just haunted, it was inhabited by something that fed on the presence of the living. In 2010, the Indian government reinforced its restrictions on Bangar, increasing security and imposing fines on anyone caught trespassing after dark. The move was prompted in part by a series of incidents involving tourists who had ignored the warnings and suffered consequences ranging from unexplained injuries to complete disappearances. One particularly disturbing case involved a foreign couple, backpackers from Europe, who decided to camp in the ruins despite being explicitly told not to. They were last seen entering the fort at dusk, laughing and taking selfies. When they did not return the next day, a search was launched. Their belongings, including their play, backpacks, tent, and camera, were found in one of the palace courtyards, but the couple themselves were gone. The camera contained photographs taken throughout the day, showing them exploring the ruins, smiling and carefree. But the final photograph, taken just after sunset, showed something that chilled investigators to the bone. In the background of the image, barely visible in the dim light, were figures, dozens of them, standing motionless in the shadows, watching. The couple's faces in the photograph were no longer smiling. They looked terrified. The couple was never found, and the case remains unsolved. The photograph was shared widely on social media and in paranormal communities, analyzed and debated endlessly. Some claimed it was proof of the curse, evidence that the spirits of Bangor's long-dead inhabitants still lingered, trapping those who dared intrude. Others argued it was a tragic coincidence, that the couple had simply gotten lost or fallen victim to natural hazards. But the villagers who live near Bangor have no doubt about what happened. They say the fort claims souls, that it is a place where the boundary between the living and the dead has been eroded by centuries of suffering and unresolved rage. They say the curse is real, that Sinkia's final words were not just a threat, but a binding spell, one that ensures Bangor will never be at peace. Today, Bangor Fort remains one of India's most infamous haunted locations. Thousands of tourists visit each year, drawn by the legends and the promise of a glimpse into the supernatural. The Archaeological Survey of India continues to maintain the site, and guides lead tours during daylight hours, recounting the history and the stories with a mixture of reverence and caution. But as the sun begins to set, the guards usher everyone out, locking the gates and retreating to their posts outside the walls. They do not patrol the interior at night, and they do not linger near the entrance. They have heard the stories, seen the evidence, and they know better than to tempt fate. The signs remain, stark and unambiguous, warning that entry after sunset is forbidden, not by tradition or superstition, but by law. And while the official reason is safety, those who know the truth understand that the law is not there to protect the fort. It is there to protect the living from what waits inside. There are nights when travelers passing near Bangor report seeing lights in the ruins, flickering like candles in the windows of the abandoned palaces. There are nights when the wind carries sounds, music, laughter, screams, echoes of a time when the fort was alive, now twisted into something unnatural. And there are nights when the silence is so complete, so absolute, that it feels like the world itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The curse of Bangor is not just a story passed down through generations. It is a living thing, a presence that permeates the stones and the air, a reminder that some places are marked by tragedy so deep that it becomes eternal. Princess Ratnavati never found peace, and neither did the thousands who died when the fort fell. Their spirits remain, trapped by the curse of a sorcerer who could not accept rejection, bound to the ruins by forces beyond understanding. For those who have ignored the warnings, who have stayed in Bangor after dark and lived to tell the tale, the experience is described as transformative, but not in a positive way. They speak of a fear that goes beyond the rational, a terror that settles into the bones and refuses to leave. They describe feeling watched by unseen eyes, hearing footsteps that follow no matter how fast they run, and seeing figures that should not exist, shadows that move against the light, faces that appear in reflections and then vanish. Some report losing time, entering the fort at dusk and emerging hours later with no memory of what happened, their bodies covered in bruises and scratches they cannot explain. Others speak of dreams that haunt them for months afterward, Nightmares where they are back in the ruins, unable to escape, pursued by something that wants more than just to frighten them. It wants to keep them. Bangor Fort stands as a testament to the power of a curse, to the idea that words spoken in hatred and despair can echo through centuries, shaping reality in ways that defy logic. It is a place where history and legend are inseparable, where the line between myth and truth has been blurred by time and tragedy. The Indian government may forbid entry after dark, but the real barrier is not the locked gates or the guards. It is the knowledge, shared by everyone who has felt the weight of Bangor's curse, that some places are not meant for the living. They belong to the dead, to the restless spirits who cannot leave, and to the darkness that claims anyone foolish enough to challenge it. The ruins will continue to crumble, the walls will continue to fall, but the curse will remain, as enduring as the stones themselves, a reminder that some sins are never forgiven, some tragedies never forgotten, and some places will never be free. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.